I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon. My name is Betsy Corcoran. I am CEO and co-founder of EdSurge. We're a news source and actually a huge information resource on education technology. I started the company about 4 years ago. We publish regular newsletters. We publish a lot on our website. We have a catalog of 1,500 education technology tools, and we're running about 12 conferences around the country this year where we bring together educators, entrepreneurs for a dialogue about what technologies is being developed and what educators need and what entrepreneurs are trying to do with it. So encourage you to take a look at EdSurge. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We realize that it's 3:45, that you've had a long couple of days here, that you're a little fried, okay? And so we are hoping to make this the most intimate and personal and engaging and useful panel that you will experience here at the Milken Conference. So to do that, before we start off, that's a high bar. Well, that's a high bar. I set the bar high. We do this at our company, too. First, I'd like to actually get a little bit of feedback from you guys so that we have a sense of how you're thinking about this. Are any of you actually investing currently in education technology companies? Brave man. All right, so we've got a handful of people. Are you thinking of investing in education technology? Good, okay. Do you think that education technology is the strangest thing that you have ever heard of? No, good. Maybe. You're not sure. Well, you have said you might invest, too. So our goal will be to convince you by the end of this session that it's either good or bad, and we won't tell you which. Terrific. Well, we have a very good panel, and what we are going to talk about here today is really this question. Education technology has gone through many ups and downs. When I entered this field, I sat down with a woman who had started a company. And she said to me, yeah, well, we sold our company for $80 million. And I said, wow, that is the best outcome that I have encountered so far in education technology. She said, yeah, except we'd invested $200 million in the company. It was not a great outcome. Education technology has had a very, very pocketed history. Back in the 1980s, when we got very excited about computers in the classroom, put lots of computers in there, and in fact, too frequently, they simply became a source of asthma for children as dust piled up and they were not used. So what's different this time? So the hope that I have for this panel is that we're going to talk about what's different this time. Is it different this time? What are the opportunities out there for investors? Is any of this stuff making a difference for education? Because, oh, and by the way, even if it's a great investment opportunity, if it is not moving the needle on education, is that really a long-term successful investment? Is it a long-term successful company? So we have a really interesting group of people to answer these questions. So I'm going to introduce them one by one, and we'll see where we get to. I'm going to start first with Chantel Polson. Chantel is going to be a partner as of tomorrow because she has been with New School Venture Fund, which has been a nonprofit that helped really get the charter school movement started, and then has now been investing in edtech startups for the last 3 years. As of tomorrow, it will be fully spun out as an independent, for-profit investing organization. Chantel, you see probably every single seed investment that comes down the pike. Everyone stops at your door. And you've been doing this for about 3 years now.
Yep.
Is the quality of the technology, is the quality of the ideas, is the quality of the entrepreneurs getting better, or is it getting worse?
Well, I'll definitely start by saying we're definitely seeing an uptick in the number of deals and the level of activity. And a lot of that is due to a stronger and healthier ecosystem, thanks to people like EdSurge, who's providing information to prospective entrepreneurs, thanks to a lot of incubators and accelerators in the space. There's a plethora of them that are really helping entrepreneurs who have an idea really shape those ideas and really think about what is the best business model. So in my seat, like you said, from a seed stage perspective, I see probably 20 to 25 deals per week coming to my door. So yes, a lot of activity.
And you've invested so far in?
We've invested in 43 companies out of a $12 million fund, again, mainly at the seed stage. And I would say as the ed tech market is starting to mature, what I am seeing is a lot of Me Too companies. So we are now at a place where it's getting harder for companies to actually differentiate themselves because we do have some great big players in the space. And so a lot of things are starting to look alike. Well, that being said, I am still seeing a lot of great companies, a lot of great and talented entrepreneurs with some great ideas. So I don't think it's over. I think we're just going to have more waves of innovation. So very excited still about this space.
So just to give you a timeline, and by way of background, I spent 20 some years writing about technology companies in general, not education. What happened was in around 2010, 2011, we started to see this emergence of the ed tech entrepreneur, of the class of companies that Chantel is seeing every single day. They were fueled by an interest in education. They were fueled at that point by still a stuttering economy, and so not so many job opportunities. And they were fueled by this sense that technology was beginning to evolve to the point where it could go into the school system. Jason Young is, in fact, one of these entrepreneurs. And Jason has been running a company that offers a financial literacy app for high school students. Jason, talk a little bit about why you got into it when you did, and should you have both a social mission as well as a financial mission? Talk a little bit about how you balance those two.
Sure. So to the first, for me, it was really following my passion, which was entrepreneurship, and just a strong desire to have that passion result in something that was actually going to help people. Now, you asked about kind of balancing the social mission around, against the, I guess, profitability, would you say?
Yes.
And so what's really interesting to me, if we look at our business model.
And why don't you describe your business model too?
So we distribute to schools and nonprofits. We offer the product for free. We sell to financial institutions and other organizations who have the opportunity to sponsor it. And so when we look at the amount that we're able to charge, the folks who are paying versus what you say may be able to charge for a consumer app and or for some other types of educational apps, what we find is that we're able to charge a lot more.
More than other financial apps?
Not more than other financial apps, more than other, say, just straight consumer technology apps, as well as more than some educational apps. And so, what we found is that the mission-driven piece actually helps us out quite a bit. So first of all, the ability to tap other capital sources, which can then, essentially allow us to take our investment dollars much farther, and two, to actually monetize much better. Now, I'm not saying that's everybody, but I think that mission-driven can actually be a very strong asset in terms of building profitability if you're smart about it and do it the right way.
Do your investors have the same demands on you that the WhatsApp guys had?
Well, I think it's about stage, right? So I think that our investors, because we are still early stage, we have not raised a seed round. And so I think that you would see that those demands would ratchet up significantly once you kind of get past the seed round to the Series A. I think a Series A investor is a Series A investor, and they are under demands from their limited partners to deliver returns, whether they're in education or otherwise.
So last year we saw, depending on which numbers you count, certainly $1.5 billion, almost close to $2 billion going into early stage ed tech investments. That's huge in contrast to where it's been. It's, by some counts, that's almost 50% greater than it had been a year or so ago. Of course, by contrast, it's a relatively small drop in the bucket in contrast to, say, consumer tech. But we have seen this influx of funds, and as you said, there's also an influx of funds from nonprofits and from other sources as well, fueling all of these companies that Chantel is seeing all the time. Now, Mitch, you've been in ed tech for a long time. You're currently with Instructure, which I can say is a company that we're expecting to see head for the public markets at some point this year. But you've also had a long history in education technology.
Indeed.
Is it different this time?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the asthma problem, right? Which I think is an interesting way to think about it. 20 or 30 years ago, we spent a lot of money, right? Equipping schools with network infrastructure and hardware, and we clustered those things in computer labs, and we threw software at them, and we thought that magically students were going to have better outcomes and get smarter, and it sort of didn't happen, right? Kids didn't generate increasing levels of outcomes and returns as you might think about them in education just by simply digitizing some portion of the school environment. There should be something instructive for us about that. I've sat on both sides of this equation, both as a public sector employee working in school districts and state superintendent's offices and also in the private sector, and was, much to my own shame, probably complicit in a number of these investments that were made in education, where we sold lots of boxes, lots of operating systems, lots of office suites, under the guise that somehow magically that was going to transform or revolutionize education. And it didn't happen. I think what's different this time, to your point, is that we recognize that, one, the multitude of influences that play in the education space, that would be the motivation of parents, the motivation of students, the politics, the bureaucracies, the government policies, are aligning against this notion that all of those investments were probably necessary preconditions to get to today, where you can make a teacher and a student's life infinitely easier and produce better outcomes by focusing on the teachers and the students in the classroom, not the wires in the walls, not the computer boxes in the in the lab someplace, but actually on things that make a difference in the way that teaching and learning happens. It's one of the interesting things I think about Instructure is that we believe, and I think the market has responded to, really well-built, easy-to-use software that draws together resources for teachers and students to actually provide efficiency and scale of learning inside the classroom, as opposed to just being an also-ran add-on, one more thing that somebody has to do. So I think the opportunity for investors in education really this time around has to do with looking for those companies that are solving a real problem for teachers and students, that are doing it in an elegant way that actually makes their lives easier and not harder, and that has some confluence with all of those political and social motivations that are really, I think, this time around coming together in this investment cycle.
Which still begs the question of whether we're going to see, as you pointed out, genuine outcomes, improvements in outcomes of students, which is a question we're going to come back to in a couple of minutes. But I want to draw Susan Wilford into the conversation. She's a banker. Yeah, you have a pretty sort of gimlet eye about this stuff, right?
I suppose.
Is education technology an area where you feel people should be investing right now?
Yes. I mean, to start off with a declarative statement, they absolutely should. I think that everywhere at the moment, investments are inflated. There's a lot of money in the system.
I think the word you used before was frothy.
Frothy is another good word you can use, but it's not just in education. So, I run a fairly broad group of. Well, I personally only do education investment banking. However, people in my group do internet, digital media, a lot of frothy sectors. And across the board, what we see is, putting aside like true tech stuff, normal everyday companies that are not hard to value are probably trading on average at 15 to 25% premiums over what I would say intrinsic value is, and what I would say over the long course of 30 years of doing this, I think is what one would expect. So there's a lot of money in the investment community at the moment, and that manifests itself in multiples for long-standing companies that we understand very well being valued at the high end of what their natural value is. In ed tech, and tech in general, but certainly in ed tech, it's not easy to value companies. Like, it's far more subjective. And so to sit here today and say, well, they're going at a 20% premium would be impossible, because we never know for several years, and sometimes for many years, until after a company's out, as to what the intrinsic value was at the time that you did the B round. So I don't, actually I would hold back in my commentary about the valuation levels persistent in or present today in ed tech. But I do think that in general, the markets are frothy. Education is no exception. And education comes at it having been starved for several years, right? So if you go back to the recession, education is a cyclical business. So we're pretty, when people talk about ed tech being so different, there are many things about education that are just like all other businesses, and there's a few things that are unique. Not, in my opinion, it's not the other way around. But the things that are unique enough that we say to investors, unless you intend to spend the time to understand our eccentricities, then you need to stay away because you need to understand them. They're not normal business risk like bureaucratic customers. Not normal business risk. That's an abnormal business. So you need to be willing to spend the time to do it, but once you do it, it's just another risk. So I guess I'd say, it's frothy, but everything is frothy. There's a lot of money, but there's a lot of money everywhere. The one difference in education that we point investors to, if they're willing to do the work, what we say is we've just gone through one of the worst spending cycles in education because of the recession. There is pent-up demand. There are ridiculously poor results everywhere in K-12 and higher ed, so there's an opportunity for it. So if you find the right company and you find the right opportunity, it stands to reason that you have a marketplace that has more capital available to it because they underfunded it for 5 years, and you have you have a set of problems that everybody recognizes are not acceptable. Illiteracy rates of 40%, fourth graders in urban, that's unacceptable. So if you have a product that actually could prove it, so I guess I'd say it's a great time, but like everything, you have to proceed with caution.
So a couple of interesting points you've raised. So one is, this pent-up demand question. 4 years ago when we started EdSurge, probably one of the questions that I encountered the most were people saying, well, does technology even have a role in classrooms? Should it be in there? The question that we hear more frequently today is, okay, what's the proper role of technology in a classroom? Chantel, you talk to, this is really kind of open questions now for everyone. You're talking to entrepreneurs, they're talking to school leaders. Do you sense a change in the appetite or the interest of school leaders in using some of the different tools that you're seeing, that you're building? What do you hear? Where's the demand? How would you measure the demand in the marketplace?
Yeah, and I think the demand is at a couple different levels. So from a school leader perspective, what we're really seeing is a demand to really understand data. So one of the big areas of investment that we've seen kind of increase over the years is data analytics for schools. And school leaders are really looking for ways to understand what's happening with their teachers and what's happening with their students in any way that I can present data in a very digestible way. School leaders are hungry for that data. On a teacher level, like you were alluding to, teachers want things that are going to make their lives so much easier, whether it's easier to grade my papers, whether it's easier to understand where all of my students are sitting. That's really what teachers are wanting. And also, I think where technology can really play a role is actually differentiating instruction. So teachers have been trying to do this, instead of getting in front of a class of 30 students and having to give the same lesson to all 30 students when I know all of my students are not at the same level. How can I leverage technology to really help me kind of differentiate instruction for each of those different students? And that's really a place where we're seeing an increased demand for these different tools.
Right.
I'd say one of the things that's interesting now that wasn't so present before, right, is this transition from analog to digital. I think it's now become a foregone conclusion that the world is no longer, in education, going to be an analog world. It's not one where we can buy textbooks that have a 7-year or 15-year shelf life, right? And to the point that you're making about this notion of differentiation, it's very hard to differentiate instruction if all you have available to you is your time, your expertise, and a text, right? We now understand that digital tools, applications, and platforms have the ability to scale the teacher's ability to differentiate and personalize with supplemental materials, with a whole host of things that before were either too expensive, weren't available, weren't culturally relevant, weren't, right? Now we have all of the tools at hand and a marketplace, right? The things that we're talking about of entrepreneurs who are seeking to fill that vacuum that had existed for, low 30 years. And now it becomes much easier to actually drive those things into the classroom and hasten that transition.
And in an environment where the diversity of the needs, the abilities, the experiences of the kids coming into the classroom is actually far greater than it has been really at any point ever. Right. Jason, I mean, you talk to a lot of these kids. Talk about what you hear from students about what they're expecting out of their education these days.
That differs widely. So I think there's what they expect, and I think it's what they're experiencing. So I would say that expectations in many cases are very low. So I think
Okay, so they're already checking out.
So
That's bad.
Well, I mean, I think you have so for instance, in our space, financial literacy, right?
Right.
It is the worst taught subject probably in the country. It's just taught in an incredibly boring way. And so when you think about students entering a financial literacy class, well, they expect to be bored. The teacher expects them to be bored. And so
So this is nap period.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
we do see a lot of that, right? On the other hand, students do have expectations generally about how they interact with the world, and they do have expectations around technology, just generally in their everyday lives, right? And so what I will say is that when they go into the classroom, that experience often does not match their general expectations of the world, and so then you have this huge disconnect. And I think that to the extent that you can bring those general expectations in line with the classroom expectations, what you get is very pleasant surprise and very high engagement. But I would say that the expectations right now are really low unless you are fortunate and you go to a really, really great school.
So we have, maybe you guys could share a little bit. Susan had started to mention that this industry has some challenges, right? It has bureaucracy. There are plenty of challenges. What are some of the other elements that are unique to this business that you're starting to see people work through this time around in contrast to the last time around? For instance, one of the big chicken and egg questions is, who do you sell to? Do you sell to the teacher? Do you sell to the district? Do you sell to the student? What are you starting to see among the business models that are emerging, and what's actually working?
Yeah, so I think companies now are beginning to figure out how to navigate those challenges within procurement a couple different ways. So within our portfolio, we have some companies who are looking at ways to leverage channel partners within education so that you...
What's a channel partner?
A channel partner within education, for example, would be an education service agency. So basically, they're a conglomeration of all of the districts in a region. And so instead of selling and going and saying, I have to sell to this individual school, I have to sell to this individual district, I can sell now at that layer up at the ESA level, and then now I'm selling on behalf of a multitude of districts. And so basically, you can just penetrate the market so much faster. And so one of the companies in our portfolio, Bright Bites, has been able to do this and been able to get their market share, and that they're now in kind of one in 10 schools in the US. Another way that we've seen is kind of this blend of a freemium model and kind of a top-down sales model. So starting kind of from a grassroots, basically building adoption from teachers, kind of a bottoms up, get teachers very excited about a product, and then when you have a concentration mass of teachers within one school, then you basically convert that school. And so you say, hey, we noticed that you have 30 teachers in your school using our product. We can now upsell you this version that allows you to either see data, allows you to have all your teachers on the same license. And so that way, you're both getting kind of the spread virally through growth, but also being able to then monetize at the school and district level.
Is that just a sales trick, or is that? It sounds like a sales trick, but we've also seen that the classic idea of you sell to the senior superintendent in a district once, and then they just push that out to every single teacher. Is that a broken model?
It's often broken, and the reason is when you have that kind of top-down, push-out approach, a lot of times teachers don't feel bought into the process.
Would that be LA?
Potentially, right? What happened in LA? I'm not bought in. I don't know why I have to use this product. I'm not excited to use this product. And then what happens kind of on your sales side is then things aren't renewed. So I bought all these things on behalf of my teachers, then your usage level is extremely low, and then they're not going to renew for the next year. So that's why I think just having teachers at the table and having their voice heard and making sure they're really excited about the product is really important, even if you're going to do a district level sale.
Mitch, have you been growing virally? Has Instructure been growing that way? And tell us a little bit about, can you actually grow virally in this industry? I'd love to hear some, maybe we could share some examples of companies that you're seeing actually have viral adoption, and what does viral mean in this industry?
So I think we've seen modest success as it relates to the model that you describe. We certainly have an approach which we call Free for Teachers, which is not a sales trick. It really is part of the ethos of the company, and that is that much as the actual core of our application is open source, we believe that teachers should have access to a wide variety of tools, whether their district or their whoever has chosen to purchase those things or not. And certainly, we've had lots of teacher organic adoption, which has generated then a sort of traditional B2B sort of sale, right? Where we then have an enterprise sale with a district to say, look, you've got 400 teachers who've actually created on their own accounts in this platform. They've found good use of it. They've become evangelists within the districts, and it certainly makes the sale infinitely easier.
So what's lots? Give us some numbers. What's lots?
Oh, I mean, tens of thousands of actual K-12 users in that space who've taken the initiative themselves to sign up for an account and use our platform in their classroom sort of in isolation, right? Not that the district has purchased and then forced it out and made everybody adopt. I think the point about the inclusion of teachers, and I would extend the argument to say students today, right, in this process is critically important. That notion of organic adoption is one way. The other is through your traditional procurements and expanding the footprint of the people who are actually involved. The downside to that, obviously, is that sometimes those things take longer, right? They're harder, they're more complex sales. The one last comment that I'll make, is we're sort of throwing out lots of positives. There are also some issues that we have to discuss. So this notion that working with ESAs or ESDs or BOCES, depending on where you are in the country, right? They've all got
many
different
acronyms.
names. Essentially, they're demand aggregators in this space, right? They bring together a number of consumers and try to aggregate that demand. Can lead to price compression, right? Which means that now you've got aggregated demand. Yes, it's easier to sell, but the margins become thinner simply because they've aggregated that demand and are putting pressure on you to say, here are 70 or 100 school districts who would like to purchase. We'd like the very best price that you've ever given anybody everywhere for our million students.
Good for the consumers, maybe not so good for the business.
Right. So there's a healthy balance that you have to strike, right? And if the product has enough value, if it has enough impact, and it has enough sort of organic traction, some people are able, right, and this is where the intelligent investor with some patience and persistence comes in, are able to navigate those waters and continue to find, a healthy business model. Others aren't.
Susan started referring earlier to characteristics of good investors in this space. Are they like every other investor? Are there some particular characteristics of EdTech investors that make them a breed apart?
Well, I think that what we tell people is this is specialized. Energy investing is specialized, right? Education investing is specialized. You don't think of it as necessary to have as much specialized knowledge. Like everybody would agree, I'm not going to invest in an oil well without being in it.
So what are three things that your education investor really ought to know before they dip their toe in this water?
They have to know there's a long selling cycle. They have to know it's a bureaucracy, and so sometimes things that should be don't happen the way they should, right? These are not necessarily economically driven decision makers. There's more to it. There's politics. There's all kinds of things. So I think the long sales cycle, the political and sort of the politicized nature of the sale needs to come into play, and the fact, frankly, that it's a hits-driven business. You don't think of education as being hits-driven. You think of that as entertainment. I used to do entertainment banking years ago. I hated it because I couldn't, who knows if this movie's going to be. I hated it. I couldn't even stand getting off the plane in LA. But
you're back.
Yeah, but what's happened, when I got in education, I thought, well, this is going to be so much better. It's data-driven. It either works or it doesn't. Not so much. Teachers have a view that they love this year, and it's the best thing that they've ever seen. And 3 years later, they don't want it. They're done with that. We're done with that now. So they have to recognize there's a whole bunch of things, but those three things are most investors. It puzzles them. It shouldn't be this way.
So I take away from that finicky and irrational, right? Is sort of the
buyers.
Right.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think they're finicky and irrational?
Jason, what are you seeing when you try to move your product?
Well, it's interesting because you're dealing with so many different factors. So, for instance, we go to teachers, and when we deal with teachers, the first question is just that, going back to, are we making their lives easier? But we do games. Some teachers don't like games.
So you should explain. You have a game that helps teach.
Yeah, so our game teaches financial capability to young people. So think budgeting, credit cards, debt management, etc. And so some teachers fundamentally don't believe that a game is an educational tool. And so that is, one thing that you sometimes, may have to deal with, right? So everybody has their kind of viewpoint. But I would actually like to take a step back because you mentioned education being a hits-driven business. And I would argue that technology as an industry is a hits-driven, industry. I mean,
We are a little faddish, aren't we?
we're a little bit, but I would say that if you look at 65%, I think, of kind of venture investments, fail to return even, the money that was invested, and it's really kind of like 4% that are driving those, outsized returns. That's definitely a hit-driven industry.
The difference being, though, that I think the things that fail in regular tech are consumer-driven tech applications. Less business. Like I think of the business purchases that our big bank has made.
Yeah.
We're not ripping it out every 3 years. In fact, quite the contrary.
Yeah.
It's like I complained to you about my BlackBerry as we sat down. Like we're going to ride BlackBerry into the ground. Okay, we're taking that right on to the bottom. So I think that they spend a lot of time with the RFP. They come about it in a rational way from an economic perspective. They go through all the many. It's not as emotionally driven. And I hate to sound like the teachers are out there being like crazy, but I do think that if you expect schools to be run like a business, then you will be disappointed. They're not businesses the way a business is a business. In fact, we talked about hospitals. They're not even as much of a business as a hospital is a business. It's somewhere between consumer and business.
But let me come back to, I want to come back to efficacy. I want to come back to this question of whether we are seeing any improved outcomes, because if we want to make this more than just a hit space business, if we want to say it's data-based, based on data, then we should see some outcomes. And so my question for you guys is, what can we say about the outcomes that come from using this technology? Can we say anything? Can we point to any leaders? And what's the challenge? I mean, there's some obvious challenges with gathering that data. I'm also going to let you all know out here that in a couple minutes, I'm going to turn to you. So start thinking of some questions, because this is our effort to personalize our session. But what do we know? What's working? Can we say that anything is working?
Well, I'll start.
Instructure's working.
We think so, and I think we're investing a lot of money in figuring out how to answer that question with some precision as opposed to anecdotes.
Okay,
right?
so can you tell us what makes Instructure work? What do you use to measure that efficacy?
Yeah, well, so we've got 18-ish million users on the platform, a combination of higher ed and K-12. As you can imagine, that generates a mountain of data, right? If you depersonalize that data and begin to look at how students are interacting with the platform, what kind of content is in use, what kind of content produces the anticipated results, i.e. the definition of efficacy, right? We're making a number of investments in that space, right, and doing our own research and also working with others, obviously with the appropriate rights, permissions, and security.
Give us an example.
Of the Instructure platform?
You just said you're making some investments in understanding this.
So let me actually take a step back from the Instructure piece as the sort of platform that begins to aggregate a lot of this content. I would say we're in the infancy of being able to answer your question with precision and things that I'd be comfortable defending, right? I think we know from the case studies that we've done with a number of K-12 school districts that they believe that it's actually generating better outcomes for their students on a wide variety of scales, from social engagement to actual test and outcomes-based performance measurements, the teachers' views on the way in which they're able to teach in their classroom. We've got data that supports all of those kinds of models to say, yes, efficacy is being achieved. But if we take a completely different perspective for a second, there was an acquisition that was announced this week, right? HMH acquired Scholastic's ed tech business. One of the products that's really interesting to me in that portfolio is Read 180, right? Read 180 has a universe of data that says if you use this tool for remediation and intervention, and you take students who are 2 years behind in their actual performance levels, right, 2 years behind grade level in their ability to read, and you put them through this program, which is completely technology-based, helps the teachers to remediate instruction in a classroom where they might have students anywhere from 4 years to 4 years behind to above, that you actually can verify 2 years worth of gains in some finite period of time. Those are the kinds of examples that I think are the things that we can point to say, here's where technology is remarkable as it begins to transform the classroom.
Chantel, do you feel that the companies that you're investing in have an opportunity to, most of them are pretty small and pretty young, so they don't really have millions of data points, but are they setting themselves up to demonstrate efficacy?
Yeah, so a couple of our companies have had the ability to do kind of small-scale research studies. So
Can you mention any in
so for
particular?
example, eSpark has done studies with the NWEA tests and have shown progression with students using eSpark year over year. What is challenging, like I said, our companies are very small. I'm at the seed stage. It's usually 2 to 5 people, very resource constrained. But what they are looking at is leading indicators. And so, like you talked about, these kind of anecdotes from teachers saying, I am noticing that my kids are super engaged when using this product. And that's one of the things that we really look at, because you can't even have any efficacy if students aren't even engaged in the product. So it's kind of like step number one. So looking at engagement, looking at other leading indicators around teacher satisfaction, user satisfaction, and that's kind of how we get started around efficacy. But yeah, that is one of the biggest challenges for our companies, and thinking about kind of maybe what are some other kind of third parties that can help these companies start to kind of measure it at a more kind of effective level.
And we are actually seeing the emergence of some pilot efforts, right? So for instance, in Chicago, there's a program called LEAP, which is entirely around trying to measure efficacy. Silicon Valley has a similar program called iHub. The Gates Foundation has said they want to fund something like 7 more centers like this around the country. So there are some hope for these things, but we haven't yet seen them. Mitch mentioned that Scholastic was sold last week, and it was sold for about $575 million, I think. By contrast, we've only seen a couple of unicorns in this industry. If you want to make it broad, you can say lynda.com became a unicorn, selling for $1.5 billion. Does that seem fair? Scholastic, which has, as he said, actual data, efficacy, a huge backlog of content, selling for $575, Lynda selling for $1.5 billion. What does that tell us about how the market's valuing these companies?
To look at is what the prospective growth is, right? And so Read 180's been out for 20 years,
It's a long
certainly
time,
50, a long
absolutely.
time, and it probably grows at 8%,
At
maybe,
best, probably.
maybe. Great product, but it's had and it will continue to be a great product, and they paid roughly 10 times EBITDA for it. That's actually pretty reasonable. I'm growing at 10%, I'm growing at 8 to 10%. I got it at 10 times multiple. That's pretty reasonable. We talked at the beginning about frothy, not frothy, like what you'd expect. Lynda.com is a whole nother thing, right? Lynda.com is growing at purportedly 25 to 30%. Is that what the numbers I've been hearing? 25 to 30%. It's a consumer product. It's not bound by how many students there are in K through 12 or higher ed or anywhere. It's a consumer product. Do I think it's valued pretty high at 10 times revenue? I think it's valued pretty high at 10 times revenue. But on the other hand, 40% of the deal was funded by stock, which is also trading at 10 times revenue.
So a lot of froth here.
So, but they didn't really get the 10 times yet. They didn't get the $1.5 billion is the point.
Right.
Now, would I rather own LinkedIn at 10 times than lynda.com? Maybe, maybe because it's certainly more liquidity. There's a lot of things go into that headline price before you get too excited. That's the problem.
What's your level of optimism that we're going to see more unicorns in the classic education
So what's your
space?
definition of a unicorn?
billion-dollar valuation
Oh,
company.
there's plenty coming.
There's plenty coming. Name 3.
No, I'm not going to name 3.
Name 2.
No,
1?
no.
No. Well, that's not very
I know
helpful.
I'm being grumpy, but I can't because of course that's my pipeline list. So there's no way I'm telling my competitors where they should be focused. But of course we're waiting for Blackboard to come out, right? Of course we're waiting for Blackboard.
Instructure.
And we're waiting for that's why no. I was saying to him, Blackboard's coming. His competitor's going to come out, and lynda.com's competitor, Pluralsight, every reason to think that Pluralsight's going to be right there with them. You know, there's forget ed tech, Laureate's going to come out at a beautiful price, because when Houghton Mifflin trades at 15 times EBITDA for a company that grows at their own admission of 6%, that's a good time to go public. That is a beautiful world by a seller's perspective. So there'll be, if the market holds up, there will be a half a dozen companies that go public in the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, that's a good prediction. Half a dozen over the next 12 to 18 months. You can hold her to that when she comes back
If
next
the
year.
market holds up.
Okay. I'm going to ask another question, and then we're going to go to you guys. Are there segments of ed tech that are now oversaturated? For instance, Chantel, you mentioned that you're starting to see some Me Too's in there. Are there segments that we're seeing that are oversaturated, or are there any areas that are really still untouched?
Yeah, so there's both. But I'll start by saying that yes, there's areas that are oversaturated, but that doesn't mean that there can't be companies that are disruptive in those areas and can really still be successful. So some of the areas that I see a ton of companies, LMS, for example, that
LMS,
market.
so learning management
Learning
systems.
management systems.
That would
But
be him.
you can still be successful, but again, like you have to compete against the instructors. And so what makes you so different that you feel like you can beat them? But I still see a ton of those, especially globally. A lot of like Latin American LMSs, I'm seeing a lot of those. The other areas are things like language learning. So a ton of language learning companies. So why are you better than Duolingo? You would have to convince me of that. The other area is this kind of college and career space. And so thinking about how do I select the best college for me? How do I know how to do my college search? Or how do I
pay for college?
How do I pay for college? And also just thinking about the transition from college to career. So a lot of companies in those spaces. But again, they're still ripe for innovation. There's a lot of saturation in those spaces.
Any areas that are really underserved?
So definitely areas that serve special populations. So areas such as special education, areas such as English language learners, where we know that population is growing drastically in the U.S. and there's still not even a lot of content and scaffolded content for those learners. So those are two areas I'd say kind of underserved at this point.
Good. If you have a question, you need to raise your hand up high so I can see you against the lights, and we have a mic that will come your way. So, gentleman here in the brown jacket, or whatever color it is. Sorry.
Hey everyone, great panel so far. We've been hearing a lot about precision medicine at this. Conference. Do you guys care to share some opinions on precision education, and that we can use data to tailor our curriculum, and that not everybody learns the same way?
That is a great question. So precision medicine, our version of precision medicine winds up being called personalized learning. But what are we seeing? So maybe we have a lot of conversation about personalized learning. What is a great example, not just a hand-wavy example, but a great example of personalized learning that we're seeing out there?
Well, the driver, of course, being Newton. I mean, the big publisher, everybody kind of acknowledges that's got one of the most powerful personalized learning engines. So we can argue about their business model, but they certainly seem to have a product that is used by the most sophisticated developers of educational content, which are the big publishers. We might not like to we might like to pretend that they're not the most sophisticated developers of education content, but they are.
They would be the textbook companies.
The textbook companies, the big publishers, and they buy the product of this relatively little bitty company. You know, it raised lots of money, but not a big powerhouse from a financial performance perspective. Yet they go there and they buy that, and I find that astonishing. That someone like Pearson and Houghton Mifflin and McGraw-Hill buy a platform that's developed by a relatively small company when that's what they've done for 100 years.
So to slap another buzzword on you, Newton is considered a premier example of adaptive learning too, whereby if a student starts to go through a series of questions and they get this question wrong, the program tries to understand, did they get that multiplication of fractions wrong because they don't understand multiplication, or they don't understand fractions? And then it takes takes students on individualized paths trying to fill in the knowledge gap. So Newton is one example of that. Any others?
So,
No, how about it?
I think one of the things that's great about personalized learning is being able to deliver content right at the right level. And so one of the companies in our portfolio is called Newsella. And what they're doing is delivering current event articles. So they publish 2 articles on current events every day. And those events are delivered at different reading levels. And so if you're at a 3rd grade reading level, you get that same article at 3rd grade reading level, at a 4th grade, 5th grade, and so on. And so a teacher can basically push this article out, and we can all be reading the same rich content, but I'm reading it at my level, and I can still engage in a very rich discussion about that content, but I'm still getting it at a level that really suits my needs. So I think this ability to really tailor content in a way that's still engaging, but then really meets my needs in terms of where I am academically.
And Nuzella's been one of the fastest growing companies in your portfolio, right? Can you give us any numbers on how widespread its use is?
Yeah, so they have about 18 million users at this point across
it's
the US.
about a 2.5-year-old company?
Yep, and they're serving over 80,000 schools.
80,000 schools, great. Another question to the lady way in the corner.
Thank you very much. My question would be, what about
Hold the
EdTech?
mic.
Sorry, I have a loud voice, so I assume you just don't need the microphone. What about EdTech outside of the classroom? Coming from Europe, I'm not necessarily that familiar with, I went to university in the States, but not from a K through 12 level. Could you talk a little bit about the online learning platforms for adults? What's out there in the market in that respect?
For adults outside the US, or are those two separate questions?
Well, just in general. I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of, from what I can understand, sort of primary school, younger people, but there's a lot of movement now also outside of that, people who want to have continued learning, people who want to learn a language, people who want to learn how to code, these kinds of things, and they're no longer in the classroom environment, but it's still a huge market there.
So it is a huge market, and in fact, that's exactly what lynda.com, in a sense, was addressing. But let's talk about that for a moment. What are you seeing in the really sort of that lifelong learning outside of the classroom opportunities for different age levels?
Right, I mean, it's, to speak sort of personally about what Instructure's doing, we have a platform that serves K-12 and higher education with unique features for both of those environments. We also have recently released a product that we call Bridge, which is essentially a learning management platform for those lifelong learners, right? Targeted today at those folks who are learning inside of their organizations and their businesses. So we certainly see as a core business strategy, building really great software and experiences for people across the spectrum, from pre-K all the way into the workforce. You take with that, MOOCs, right? Everybody's had this notion that somehow these things were going to be the saviors of lifelong education. And while I'm not sure that everybody would believe that it's panned out that way, I think we've found great success in targeting specific courses to massive online communities, right? And being able to deliver those using the technology that has already been built for K-12 or higher ed or the corporate space. So I think there are lots of opportunities to both reuse the investments that are being made in a broader context, but also to build fit for purpose, either content and delivery mechanisms like MOOCs or separate platforms that help service those different constituencies.
There's actually a slide that, can you put up the second slide? It might surprise the audience. I don't know if it's possible.
Aha,
If you look at that gray bar, so the one all the way over is last year, 2014. So, the point of the slide was to show how many, it's like, I don't know, 8 billion, whatever that number is. So a lot of deals got done last year. This is M&A activity in the education sector, defined as K-12, pre-K all the way up to K-12. So everybody thinks ed tech is where the activity was. Ed tech's the red part. Ed tech is red. So it is pretty big. On the gray is corporate training. Corporate training is defined as anything that's not post-secondary and older. So it could be actually corporate training, or it could be I'm going to go out and buy a licensure for myself. It's not always paid by the company. And it is the largest part of the bar. So there's plenty of money going into lifelong learning, and it's being funded by the individuals themselves, and it's being funded by companies, and there's a huge amount of money going into credentializing. So that's our new word, our new buzzword, right? Credentializing. So I can't just learn it. I got to actually prove that I learned it. So I think that we get called by private equity firms. There's a little bit lemming-like, and so I apologize to any private equity guys in the audience, but we get calls. The minute a deal gets done that got done at a high multiple, and I'm not exaggerating, at least 6 or 7 guys will call and say, can you come talk to me about blah, 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 blah. I bet I got called on by 20 people in the last 12 months on compliance, credentializing. Come talk to us about that. And so there is a tremendous interest in it. It's not talked about as much as K-12, not nearly as much, but a lot of money's gone into it. Good question.
Thank you. In the front here, and then we'll get to you.
A huge bottleneck for getting edu-games, which are scalable and adaptive, into K-12 or K-16 for that matter, is educating teachers in how to use them, which I'm sure you've covered. Do you see the military has been the poster child for doing that? They've done a really good job of it, and that's why they're world class in that. Do you see what investment opportunities do you see for a nationwide collaborative environment for teachers to learn how to use edu-games in the classroom and share best practices?
It's a fascinating question. Jason, you want to talk a little bit about what your experience has been in teachers learning to use games, and we'll try to get to that.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the key piece is connecting with teachers and convincing them that there is value in it. While teachers are not a monolith. You have some teachers who are actually very comfortable with games. You have some teachers who are skeptical. You have some teachers who just want to do it, the way they've always done it. And so you kind of have to segment, first of all. But I think the bigger understanding is every teacher is going to face different constraints. So for instance, if you're talking about some districts, if you're talking about professional development in general, so forget about educational games, but just professional development. For them to go and get professional development, they have to fund, a sub out of their own pocket. And so that's a barrier, right, for kind of introducing, anything new, let alone a game. And so I think that when you're talking about educational games, you have to really do a segmentation and look at which teachers are going to make the most sense to approach. And then I think there has to be kind of a marketing piece around it, because it's not that these are so difficult to use. Yes, there's some mindset change, but it's really more about convincing them that this is a good thing and that it will help them, and that you're not trying to replace them, but that you are trying to complement what they're already doing. And so I just think the segmentation and the marketing approach are actually among the most important. And then you get to the actual professional development, which has to be done in such a way that it actually fits within their lives and the demands that are on their time currently.
Unless you're in Ireland, in which case every school is actually now using Minecraft, right? So, there are sort of really interesting examples that say, well, we're just going to plunge forward. The other thing is the MacArthur Foundation in the United States has been very involved in funding a whole collection of pretty interesting games. Some of that work is involved in a group called Glass Labs. And, once again, it comes back to the efficacy question, right, too. Are we seeing any improvements in learning, not just entertaining, but in learning?
Two quick,
yeah,
perhaps controversial statements in reference to this particular thing. One thing is, I actually don't believe, much to the media's chagrin, that we've got a crisis of teaching and learning in this country. I think we've got a crisis of leadership in this country.
Leadership in schools or leadership in general?
Well, let's limit it to the education space. But we truly in schools have a crisis of leadership at the principal, at the district administrator, and perhaps even at the sort of department leader level. And we could talk about that as a whole separate topic, but I think it gets right at the point of the question that you're asking is, how do you get people bought in enough to convene a conversation, to determine best practices, to build an ecosystem where people are willing to invest, right? And I think the first thing that we have to think about, and it's a big heady problem, is how to convince those leaders that both the outcomes will be produced and it's important for them to pay attention. And the second thing I think is hugely problematic, and I apologize to the university professors that may be in the room, is that the problem really begins in our teacher colleges, right? We haven't revamped that curriculum in the better part of probably 100 years. So if we really want to radically alter the way in which the instructional practice happens in the classroom to make these things more comfortable and better and okay, we've got to start there, right? And that's not something that investors can necessarily do or that I can necessarily do. It's going to have to be another wave of sort of these confluences of the expectations of the students who are entering those programs, the politics and the policies that support it, what the universities are willing to invest and change in, how they're tenuring those particular professors who are actually working in those colleges. That's, again, a very heady and systemic problem, but really the place where we're actually going to make the most substantial difference in the way that, you know, the craft of education is practiced in the classroom.
One more question. There's a lady in the back there.
Hi, thanks very much. My name is Sharon, and I support an after-school program in LA's Best. I'm in LA called LA's Best, and we serve 195 schools. So I have a couple questions. One, what do you think about all of this technology sort of being placed in after-school programming? Because that's a place where there's a little bit more flexibility, but the scope and the data that can be collected there can then move that forward. And also, how do we get it in low-income areas?
Two really great questions, and the question of equity for all of this is pretty profound. What's been the experience that you've seen in seeing some of this technology move into after-school programs? And then maybe you can say something about the equity question as well. Don't hold back.
So I think in after-school programs, what I'm seeing is just a better communication between what's happening at the school level and then how that can then be translated to the after-school level. So in programs where you're collecting a lot of data about what students are working on, basically using that data either in tutoring programs or after-school programs to then build on what students are learning in the classroom. So I think that kind of connection and communication channel is being strengthened between school and after-school with technology and the data that we're collecting. As far as the equity question, it is something that we think about a lot. And so one of the things that we've seen is just a really strong uptake with smartphone penetration. And just seeing that a lot of low-income areas actually have the highest proportion of smartphone users. And so thinking about what are the ways to make sure that the technologies that these entrepreneurs are building are mobile-enabled, and especially mobile-first, so that these students do have access to these different technologies. And so it's not just computer, it's not just a laptop, but it is things that I can do at home, especially in low-income areas where a lot of times the smartphone is their only access to the internet.
Jason, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I would just, so I would agree with that, and I think it's really interesting because in some ways after-school programs can offer greater opportunities because of that mobile-first piece.
Is your program used primarily in schools or outside of schools?
So both, but we focus more on schools. But I will say one thing that we have found is that schools sometimes have restrictive policies around the use of mobile, and the classroom may or may not be set up for the use of mobile, whereas when you think about after-school programs, as you mentioned, there's just a lot more flexibility. And so that piece is actually a positive. And if you're talking about kind of equity and low income, I think that there are barriers on each side, but I think that those barriers can sometimes be lower in after-school programs than you would find in, say, poorer school districts.
Right. So we have not begun to address all of the opportunities or some of the challenges in education technology. We talked about data. Also figuring out what data you're going to collect, who's going to own that data, is also a really important challenge that many companies are starting to face. But because we are talking about EdTech and investing, I'd like to actually do one last lightning round question. I'll ask it slowly to give you a chance to think about the answer, which is, give me two companies on your watch list, and you could have them on your watch list either because they're growing fast, because they have a very different approach, because they address something that you feel is a big need, or just because you think they're so wacky that it's really interesting and you like to watch them. So two companies on your watch list and why? Mitch.
Well, the first has already been mentioned. I think Pluralsight, which happens to share a geographic location with us, is incredibly interesting. I think their model of user-generated content that is essentially professionally built and curated, providing really great courses for people, turning some authors into rock stars with very hefty paychecks, right, as it relates to the adoption of their particular content. There's something very appealing to me about that, both business model and the way in which they've gone about producing really high-quality experiences for people. The second company is probably one that nobody's ever heard of, but a company based out of both Australia in Sydney and in Dublin, Ireland, is Learnosity, whose a company's sole purpose is essentially to power the next generation of assessments in all of our kinds of products. So it's interesting from a variety of perspectives. One, they're super young and super nimble. They've got great features and functions, but their business model is really to take and empower both the entrepreneurs and the establishment with essentially the plumbing, right, to make their products that much better, which I also think from an infrastructure and time to market perspective is super interesting.
Great. Chantel?
Okay, so I'm going to start with a watch category
Okay.
instead of a watch company. And the category that I'm paying a lot of attention to is what I call school to home communication category. And so basically strengthening the communication channel of what's happening at schools and feeding that data back to parents at home. So a couple of companies in this category would be Remind 101, Class Dojo, Fresh Grade, Kamboo, all thinking about how do we really help parents understand what's really parents and families understand what's really happening in the classroom, whether it's from a data level, whether it's from just pure information, whether it's qualitative level, but really engaging them in the process and really trying to get parents to really think about how can they help their students succeed. So it's a whole category.
Okay, so you get a whole category. Susan?
Well, I can't not say Pluralsight because I love Pluralsight, and not only for the reasons you've said, but also because of the culture. So an overused word, culture. But they've built a company that does everything you said. Financially, the performance is unbelievable. The product is unbelievable. But there's a culture. So when you'd asked about investors, what they look for, there is an intangible. When you meet a company and you say, and it happens very rarely, but you walk in and within 10 minutes you think, oh my God, like they're killing it. And they're killing it because of the people and the environment, and you can't put your finger on it, but you know it when you feel it. And so definitely Pluralsight. The other one, which is not a tech company that I would point to, is a company called Surelight. And so one of the themes we have not talked about here is globalization of education, which frankly, in my opinion, is like next to zero. We talk about globalization all the time. I can't find any. And so this company moves students from all over the world to the US. That's its business model. And instead of just moving them here and then dumping them here and then letting them, well, maybe you'll succeed, maybe you won't, you're a smart kid, maybe you're not, they actually babysit them for the first year and freshman year. And the outcomes are terrific, and they've only been around for 2 years, and I love them. And culturally, it's a terrific culture. You walk in, and this company cares as much about the educational outcome of that freshman as they do in how many enrollments they have, and that's not always the case.
Good. Jason?
So I would say two. One's already been mentioned, which is Remind, and the other is Clever. So when I think about Remind, I think that the piece about how do you engage parents is huge. We haven't talked about it that much, but it's a huge missing piece of the educational puzzle. And so any company that is successfully engaging very large numbers of parents along with teachers and students is very interesting to me. I think Clever is really interesting because they are solving this huge problem of the back end of schools and simultaneously creating access for a lot of other entrepreneurial ventures. So I think it's pretty interesting.
Terrific. And if you want to hear my two, you better subscribe to EdSurge.
Oh, you made me tell.
Absolutely. Please join me in thanking the panel.